I can unlock my phone with my face, you can access your bank account with your voice, and fingerprints are often the key information on a national ID card. All of this, face, voice, fingerprints, there are biometrics, unique algorithmic measurements of us that are revolutionizing the process of identification.
Are they using behavioral psychology, something called nudge theory, to make it where it's just easier to hand over your data and then you get your food and your clothes and your money faster? Because that would be unethical. We're testing out, again, extremely experimental, really invasive technology on people who literally have some of the least rights and protections of anyone. The enforceable, you as a citizen or a consumer cannot use these to protect you in any way, so derive no comfort from that. So I think we're entering a really interesting space in terms of what it means to be human, because as we become a more quantified world, there's going to be such a temptation to take all data about you and reduce you to zeros and ones. That is what is coming. And whether or not you want that to happen has to be something that's discussed. Yet we're rolling this technology out and saying that this is going to change the way that we work and live within the next 5, 10, 20 years. To me, that's really worrying. We need to elevate ethics for technology right to the top of the agenda.
Around the world, powerful entities are working to manipulate and influence us. You've heard about it. Trolls, bots, fake news. There are algorithms at work behind each of these. Algorithms that have been developed and designed to push specific types of content to us. Content that says, click me.
Yo lo que veo es una industria muy grande, de más de 1 millón de cuentas de Twitter, también en Facebook, también en Instagram, que se dedican todos los días a todos los partidos a tratar de manipular la conversación. Y esto lamentablemente es una industria que genera mucho dinero y que genera mucha influencia.
Advertisers have used these platforms to reach new audiences and new markets. But now we're seeing political parties learn that these platforms can also be used to sway public opinion. And so instead of selling us these goods, they're selling us world leaders or political ideologies by using the advertising infrastructure and the algorithms to slowly start nudging perspectives and nudging opinions about politics. We're seeing this shift away from purely automated accounts to more human operators. We're finding actual real people for hire to work on political campaigns, to work with more repressive governments, to target people online with this kind of speech to ultimately suppress their participation in politics and in public discussions. People are engaging with a certain topic. The algorithms might say, like, this might matter to you as well. That could be, you know, the new Avengers movie, it could be a new viral video about cats, but it could also be something of importance, such as, you know, a new breaking news story. And this is where we see bad actors trying to manipulate the popularity metric. You know, the real power in the internet is that it can bring us together, and we've seen that time and time again. So going back to that more optimistic view of what the internet can and could be for democratic society and political participation, I think it's something we need to remind ourselves of and then work towards as individuals.
Think of some of the biggest companies in the world today. There's Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, WeChat. All of them big tech with algorithms at their core. We're more than just users or customers for these businesses. We're generators of data. They need us to like them for them to be indispensable, because the more that we use them, the more data we produce. We're in the midst of a great race for data, and big tech companies are on the chase. Here in Nairobi, the dominance of Chinese tech is undeniable. From telecommunication lines to satellite networks, right down to the phones in people's hands and the apps on those phones, Chinese companies have this market, and much of the data it produces in its grasp. Transient Holdings, for instance, sells to over 40% of the mobile market in sub-Saharan Africa. Its phones sell under the brand names Techno, itel and Infinix. But its strategy doesn't end with the hardware. Data-driven apps like the music streaming service Boomplay and digital payment platform PalmPay add to a growing repository of data on African users and can help boost money-making opportunities for transient.
When you think about digital colonialism or data colonialism, I think the thing that gets lost is that the primary objective, it was about money. It was fundamentally about using power, using culture, using all these kinds of tools to impose one society on another society so that the first society could make money off of that. When you define colonialism like that, then you really start to see the resonances.
It's an incredibly important myth to say there's nothing we can do about this is the way things are. But go back 20, 30, 40 years, this was not the way things were. We need to hold on to that past, to remember it, to pass on the memory of that past, in order to show that this remains the myth that is at the core of the colonial project.
We are the bodies producing the data, but we are not necessarily the ones who benefit from that. So at stake here is people's ideas, people's dreams, people's hopes, people's frustrations being used to sell other things back to them. Where do we actually get our money back?
We're not saying no tech in Africa. We're not saying, jump over Africa as you're thinking about an internet. The internet has done a lot of really good things in Africa. It's made a lot of connections possible that were not possible even 5-10 years ago. The question is, how do you mitigate the harm? How do you make sure that you protect the good and you corral the bad? The model that we have now isn't doing that. I think we should be bold enough and brave enough to go back to the drawing board and challenge ourselves to think differently about this model. Is there a better way of doing this thing? Is there a more humane way of doing this connectivity thing that we're trying to do through all of these corporations?
Trust is fundamental to all our relationships, not just with our family and friends. We trust banks with our money. We trust doctors with our really personal information. But what happens to trust in a world driven by algorithms? As more and more decisions are made for us by these complex pieces of code, the question that comes up is inevitable. Can we trust algorithms? This is something I heard from virtually everyone I spoke to about robo-debt. They said, we're not against technology. It's not like algorithms are all bad. It's the people and the institutions designing these codes we can't seem to trust. And this really gets to the heart of our relationship with algorithms. They're often complex, hidden behind walls of secrecy, with no way for those whose lives are actually impacted by them to probe them, because they've been kept off limits. There are at least 20 different laws in Australia that explicitly enable algorithms to make decisions previously made by ministers or staff. We don't really know the full extent of how these are being applied, but there are places around the world where the use of algorithms are even more widespread.
Like here in the United States, where algorithms are being used to make big decisions across everything from the criminal justice system, health, education, and employment.
The United States has a longer history of algorithm use than many other countries. Silicon Valley is a big reason for that, of course, but also there's much looser regulation here on how private companies and governments can collect and use data. One of the most controversial examples is the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions. It's a bit of a mouthful, but its short form is COMPAS, and it's an algorithm that's been used in courtrooms across the country to assist judges during sentencing. Now, of course, algorithms can't weigh up arguments, analyse evidence, or assess remorse. But what they are being used for is to produce something known as a risk assessment score, to predict the likelihood of a defendant committing another crime in the future. This score is then used by judges to help them determine who should be released and who should be detained pending trial.
Now, the judge has to consider a couple factors here. There's public safety and flight risk on the one hand, but then there's the real cost, social and financial, of detention on the defendant, on their family, on the other. Now, historically, what happens is the judge looks into this defendant's eyes and tries to say, okay, you're a high-risk person or you're a low-risk person. I trust you or I don't trust you. Now, what algorithms are helping us do is make those decisions better.
The COMPAS algorithm was brought in to offset or balance out inconsistencies in human judgment. The assumption being, of course, that a piece of code would always be less biased and less susceptible to prejudice. However, COMPAS has faced several criticisms, primarily accusations of racial bias, inaccuracy, and lack of transparency. In 2016, a man named Eric Loomis, sentenced to 6 years in prison,
took his case to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. His allegation was that the use of Compass violated his right to due process. It made it impossible for him to appeal his sentence, since the algorithm is a black box. Impenetrable, unquestionable. Eric Loomis didn't get very far. The Supreme Court ruled the use of Compass in his sentencing was legal. The verdict, however, revealed the ways in which the ever-increasing use of algorithms is being normalised.
The court had a funny argument saying that, in fact, nobody knows where these decisions are coming from, and so it's okay. You know, it's not that the state has some particular advantage over the defendant, but that everyone is at this sort of equal playing field, and it's not that there's an informational advantage for one side or the other. Now, to me, I find that somewhat dissatisfying. I do think that in these high-stakes decisions, particularly in the criminal justice system, we don't just want to have an equal playing field of no one knows, but I think we need to have an equal playing field of everybody knows. We need to have this transparency built into the system.
For the record, Equivant, the company that sells Compass software, has defended its algorithm. It points to research it commissioned that the company meets industry standards for fairness and accuracy.
The United States has a massive racial discrimination problem in public services. That's real. So it is really understandable when agencies want to create tools that can help them keep an eye on frontline decision making in order to maybe identify discriminatory decision making and correct it. The problem is that that's not actually the point at which discrimination is entering the system. And this is one of my huge concerns about these kinds of systems, is they tend to only understand discrimination as something that is the result of an individual who is making irrational decisions. And these systems are not as good at identifying bias that is systemic and structural.
So, going back to the question that started us on this journey, can we trust algorithms? Well, the biggest thing I've learned from speaking with Asha, Virginia, Sharad, and many others is that I've actually got the question wrong. It isn't really so much about whether algorithms are trustworthy, it's more about the quality of the data that feeds them and the objectives of those designing and controlling them. Human biases, human imperfections, that's what we see reflected in our algorithms. And without better oversight, we risk reinforcing our prejudices and social inequalities.
Far too often, algorithms are programmed to assume that the past is the future that we want as well. And by the past, that's often things that are full of stigma and bias and stereotypes and rejection and discrimination. And really what we need is to create systems that allow for new future scenarios that are different from the old.
Of course we can build better tools, algorithmic tools, and I see them everywhere that I go. But what makes a difference about good tools, about just tools, is building those tools with a broader set of values from the very beginning. So not just efficiency, not just cost savings, but dignity and self-determination and justice and fairness and accountability and fair process, and all of those things that we really care about as a democracy have to be built in at the beginning from step one in every single tool.
You can follow the hashtag AllHailTheAlgorithm to stay up to date, or to check out some other content that we have available online.